The fog was thicker than usual that night, swallowing every sound except for the eerie. Snap sharp, deliberate, and drawing closer. At first, I thought it was just the branches breaking underfoot, but then I saw it two crystal-like eyes glowing through the mist, unblinking and cold. My heart stopped when the snapping sound continued, and I realized those weren't footsteps. They were its legs. The fog came in heavier than I had ever seen before. It wasn't just a light mist hovering above. The ground, it was a dense, suffocating wall that swallowed up the entire landscape. The streetlights that usually illuminated my path home barely made a dent in the haze. Their glow seemed to dissolve before it could reach the pavement, leaving me wrapped in a grayish gloom. I'd walked this road countless times before, but tonight, every step felt foreign. Houses that should have stood just a few feet away were invisible, their shapes lost to the fog. Trees loomed, like vague shadows, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The quiet was unnerving. Normally, I could hear the faint hum of distant traffic or the chatter of animals in the trees. Tonight, there was nothing, except for the snapping. It had started earlier that evening, faint and irregular. At first, I thought it was the sound of twigs breaking underfoot, maybe an animal skulking through the brush. But as the night wore on, it became clear that the sound wasn't random. It came in deliberate, rhythmic bursts. Snap, snap, snap. Like someone walking. I'd brushed it off at first. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon, maybe a tree branch cracking under the weight of the fog's dampness. But now, as I walked through the oppressive silence, the snapping was all I could think about. I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was following me. It wasn't long before the snapping returned, louder and more deliberate than before. It echoed through the fog, each snap crisp and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear where it was coming from, but the sound seemed to bounce around, directionless. The fog had a way of warping sound, making it impossible to tell how close or far something really was. Snap. My pulse quickened. The sound came again, closer this time. My stomach twisted as a wave of unease rolled over me. I wanted to tell myself it was just a person, maybe someone walking, their dog, or heading home like I was. But deep down, I knew better. There was something wrong about that sound. It wasn't natural. Snap. Snap. I turned my head, scanning the fog for any sign of movement. The streetlights were too dim to cut through the haze, and all I could see were vague shapes, trees, mailboxes, the occasional fence. But then, in the corner of my vision, I caught a faint glimmer. It was subtle at first, just a pinprick of light, but it grew brighter, sharper, until I could make out two glowing orbs piercing through the fog. Eyes. The glowing eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen before. They weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to emit their own cold, crystalline glow. They were unnervingly steady, unblinking, and fixed directly on me. My breath hitched as I took an involuntary step back. For a moment, I considered running, but my legs felt like lead. Snap, snap. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as the shape behind the eyes began to take form. The first thing I noticed was the legs long, spindly, and jointed in unnatural ways. They looked almost like the legs of an insect, except they were too large, too rigid. With every step, the joints snapped with a sound like breaking glass, sharp and deliberate. The creature's body was harder to see. The fog seemed to cling to it, masking its full form, but what I could make out was translucent, like glass or ice. Its movements were jerky, its limbs moving at odd angles that defied logic. But it was those eyes that held me in place, cold and unfeeling, watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. Snap. Snap. The creature stepped closer, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just walking, it was hunting. Fight or flight kicked in, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The snapping sound erupted behind me, faster now, more erratic. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, the fog, swallowing up everything. But I didn't care. I had to get away. My feet pounded against the pavement as my heart threatened to burst out of my chest. Snap, snap, snap. The sound was relentless, keeping pace with me no matter how fast I ran. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my stomach dropped. The creature was closer now, its snapping legs moving. In horrifying precision, each step bringing it closer to me. Its eyes burned through the fog, locking onto me with a terrifying intensity. I veered off the road and into the woods, hoping the trees would slow it down. Branches tore at my face and arms as I pushed through, but I didn't dare stop. The snapping sound was everywhere, echoing through the forest like some monstrous metronome. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Snap, snap. The sound was right behind me now. I scrambled to my feet, my hands clawing at the dirt, and leaves as I tried to get up. Through the fog, I caught a glimpse of the creature's legs long, sharp and glinting like shards of glass. It was almost on top of me. Desperate, I threw myself into a nearby hollow, pressing my body flat against the ground. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the creature could hear it. The snapping sound slowed, the rhythm changing as it moved cautiously, almost curiously. It was searching for me. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, frozen, as the snapping sound circled closer and closer. My chest burned from holding my breath, but I didn't dare make a sound. Finally, the snapping began to fade, the creature moving further into the woods. I didn't move until I was sure it was gone. When I finally emerged from the hollow, my body was trembling, and my mind was racing. The fog was still thick, and the snapping could return at any moment. But one thing was certain. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. And it was still out there, waiting in the fog. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, crouched in that hollow, clutching my knees to my chest. Every sound, even the rustling of leaves in the faint breeze, set my nerves alight. My lungs ached from the shallow breaths I forced myself to take. The snapping sound had disappeared into the distance, but I knew better than to trust it was gone. As I finally built up the courage to crawl out of the hollow, my hand brushed against something, cold and sharp. Startled, I recoiled, only to realize it wasn't a branch or rock. It was a shard, a jagged, crystalline fragment, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It shimmered faintly in the foggy gloom, its surface slick and smooth, yet humming faintly with a cold, otherworldly energy. I turned it over in my hand, noticing how light yet solid it felt, as if it didn't belong to this world. Then it clicked, it was from the creature. The snapping legs, the jagged, glass-like limbs it used to stalk me, this shard was a piece of them. My stomach churned at the thought, but before I could toss it away, I heard it again. Snap. The creature was back. This time the sound was slower, more deliberate, like it was probing the area. My heart pounded as I realized it had circled back, perhaps tracking me, perhaps never having left at all. Clutched the shard tightly, its icy surface biting into my palm, and ducked into a nearby shed I'd spotted through the thinning fog. It was barely a structure, 3 rotting walls and a roof, but it was a shelter. I crouched low, my back pressed against the damp wood, and prayed the creature wouldn't find me. The snapping grew louder, more persistent. Each snap echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. Then, it stopped. I dared to peek through a crack in the shed wall. What I saw turned my blood to ice. The creature stood just outside, its glowing eyes scanning the area with an eerie, lifeless calm. Legs glinted in the dim light, jagged and unnervingly precise. I held my breath, knowing any sound could bring it straight to me. It didn't need sound. The creature's head tilted, almost mechanically, and its eyes locked onto mine. It saw me. With a shriek that sounded like shattering glass, It lunged at the shed, its snapping legs tearing into the wood as if it were paper. I scrambled backward, clutching the shard like a lifeline. The walls crumbled around me, and the creature's jagged limbs slashed through the air, inches from my face. In pure desperation, I swung the shard, striking one of the creature's legs. A sharp, high-pitched wail erupted as the limb shattered, crystalline fragments scattering across the ground. The creature recoiled, its movements jerky and erratic, as if it hadn't anticipated the attack. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. With the shard still in hand, I bolted into the night. By the time I emerged from the woods, the fog had thinned slightly, and the snapping was no longer following me. My legs felt like they were made of lead, every step a Herculean effort, but the fear of the creature kept me moving. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where faint headlights glowed in the distance. Collapsing onto the pavement, I took a moment to catch my breath. The shard was still in my hand, its faint hum a stark reminder of what had just happened. I wanted to throw it away, to hurl it into the darkness and be rid of it forever. But something stopped me. It felt important, like a key to understanding what that thing was or how to stop it. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the safety of my home. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my eyes or hear faint snapping sounds in the distance. I told myself it was paranoia, a trick of my exhausted mind, but the shard, sitting on my desk, told a different story. It pulsed faintly at night, a soft, cold glow that seemed to grow brighter when the fog rolled in. Then I heard the news someone had gone missing near the woods. A jogger, last seen heading down the same road I'd walked that night. My stomach twisted as I listened to the report, my mind conjuring images of those crystal eyes glowing in the mist, the snapping sound closing in. I thought about the shard again. What if it wasn't just a piece of the creature? What if it was something more, a beacon, a link, or even a part of its essence? The idea terrified me, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. The fog returned with a vengeance 1 week later, thicker and more oppressive than before. I stayed inside, locking every door and window, but it didn't help. The snapping sound started. Around midnight, faint at first, then louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside. It was in the house. I grabbed the shard, its glow now blinding, and stumbled into the living room. The sound was deafening, echoing from every corner. I turned, searching for the source, when I saw it, the creature, standing in the middle of the room, its crystal eyes fixed on me, its legs snapped in. Rhythm, the sound reverberating through my skull. The shard burned in my hand, its hum turning into a piercing whine. I screamed as the creature lunged, and everything went dark. When I woke up, the shard was gone. The house was silent, the fog outside dissipating with the dawn. But the dread remained. Every night, I wait, listening for the snapping sound, knowing it's only a matter of time before the creature comes back. Because I didn't defeat it. I only made it angry. The fog was back, thicker than ever. It pressed against my windows like a living thing, curling and swirling as though searching for a way inside. The air felt heavy, colder than it should have been, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, not even the creak of the old house, just the fog and the waiting. I hadn't slept in days. Every night since it first came, I'd felt its presence, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. The shard was gone, disappeared the same morning I heard about the missing jogger. But its absence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a warning. Then, the snapping started. Snap. Snap. I froze, every muscle locking into place as the sound pierced through the silence. It wasn't far off. This time it was here, inside the house. My stomach turned to ice as the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Snap, snap, snap. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The glow came first, faint and icy, casting unnatural shadows on the walls. Then the snapping legs emerged, jointed and glinting like shards of shattered glass, It moved with impossible precision, its limbs slicing through the air as it stepped into the room. The crystal eyes burned into me, brighter and more piercing than before. They were unblinking, predatory, but this time they seemed different. This time they weren't just hunting. They were studying, as if it wanted me to understand something horrifying. I backed into the corner, clutching the wall behind me, but I knew there was no escape. The creature's snapping legs clicked closer, each step deliberate, savoring the inevitability of the moment. The fog seeped through the cracks in the walls, curling around my ankles, cold and damp. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, pressing me into place. Snap, snap. It stopped, towering over me. Its translucent body shimmered faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly rhythm. I couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. Its head tilted, those crystal eyes locking onto mine, and then I heard a voice. Not a human voice, but a sharp, grinding whisper that scraped against my mind. "You are ours now." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside me, echoing in my skull, filling every corner of my mind. I shook my head, clawing at my temples, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice grew louder, its presence expanding, consuming me. The room around me dissolved into darkness, and I realized the fog wasn't just outside. It was inside me now, twisting, invading, pulling me into something far worse than death. Snap. Snap. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its eyes, glowing brighter and brighter, until they were the only thing left. I woke up at dawn, sprawled on the floor. The house was silent, the fog outside thinning as the first rays of sunlight broke through. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt heavy, like I'd run a marathon. But I was alive. Somehow I was still alive. I sat up slowly, my gaze drifting to the table. My heart sank. The shard was back, sitting in the exact same spot where it had first appeared. But it wasn't the same. It glowed faintly now, its surface etched with strange, shifting patterns. I reached for it instinctively, but as my fingers brushed the shard, a searing pain shot through my hand. I yanked it back, staring in horror as faint cracks began to form along my palm, cracks that shimmered faintly, like crystal. The snapping sound echoed in the distance. Snap. Snap. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over. Not for me, not for anyone. I glanced at the fog, outside, thicker than it had ever been, and realized the truth. It wasn't the creature that had come for me. It was the fog itself. The creature was just its harbinger, its warning, its promise. Snap. Snap. They say every story invites something into the world, a thought, a memory, a nightmare. If you dare share this story. But remember, every retelling brings the snapping closer to your door. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is the snapping already inside your house? I always thought the stories about the cornfield were just a way to scare kids, a local legend to keep us out of trouble. But when I found myself lost in those towering stalks, the whispers became real. Something was moving between the rows, a hulking shadow with too many legs, and eyes that never blinked, watching my every step. The sound of snapping limbs echoed through the field, but they weren't mine. Not yet. And as I ran, the corn itself seemed to close in, alive and hungry to keep me there forever. I grew up in the kind of town where the streets rolled up at sunset, and the biggest events of the year were the county fair and the 4th of July fireworks. It wasn't the sort of place where you'd expect to find a monster story, but every small town has its secrets. Ours was the cornfield. The field stretched for miles, rows of golden green stalks that swayed lazily in the breeze during the summer and stood brittle and dry under the autumn moon. At first glance, it looked just like any other patch of farmland, but to the locals, it was different. They say the field is alive, my grandmother once whispered as she snapped green beans on her porch. Not just growing but breathing. Watching her words gave me chills even then, but it was the stories from the other kids that kept me awake at night. It wasn't just a field, they said. Something lived in there, a creature with eyes that never blinked, even in the darkness, and limbs that cracked and twisted like broken tree branches. The older kids swore they'd seen it, a hulking shadow that melted back into the stalks whenever anyone tried to catch a glimpse. No one really knew where the legend started. Some said it was the ghost of a farmer who had disappeared decades ago. Others claimed it was a punishment from the land itself, angered by years of overfarming. Whatever the reason, the warnings were always the same: don't go into the cornfield after dark, and if you hear the whispers, run. But kids are kids. The danger only made it more tempting. Dares to spend a night in the field became a rite of passage. I never had the guts to do it, but I'd tagged along once or twice, standing on the edge of the rows and peering into the shadows as my braver friends ventured a few steps in before bolting back out. No one ever made it far enough to prove anything, but that didn't stop the stories. Even now, years later, I can still hear the way the stalks rustled that night, without wind, without movement. Just the sound of something shifting deep within the field, waiting. Returning to my hometown felt like stepping back in time. The streets hadn't changed, the diner still served the same greasy fries, and the old cornfield loomed just as it always had, a silent sentinel at the edge of town. I hadn't planned to come back, but a high school reunion seemed like as good an excuse as any. We gathered at the local bar, a motley mix of familiar faces, some changed by time, others frozen in the past. After a few drinks, the nostalgia began to flow as freely as the beer. "Remember the cornfield?" someone asked, a lopsided grin on their face. "And those stupid dares?" I laughed, the memory warm and distant. Of course, no one ever made it past 10 minutes in. There. That's because it's cursed, another chimed in, their voice mock serious. "People who stay too long don't come out." The table erupted in laughter, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Even as adults, the legend still held a shadow over us, fueled by liquid courage and a touch of nostalgia. I made the mistake. "I'll do it," I said, my voice louder than I intended. "I'll spend the night in the cornfield. Prove it's just a stupid story." The table went quiet for a beat before erupting in cheers and jeers. "No way," someone said. "You'd chicken out in 5 minutes." "Bet me," I challenged, the alcohol making me bolder than I felt. And just like that, it was settled. I would go into the cornfield at midnight and stay until dawn. It was all in good fun, or so I thought. But as the laughter faded and my friends exchanged uneasy glances, a nagging thought crept into my mind: why did the legend still make them nervous, even now? The field looked different at night. The moon cast long shadows, and the towering stalks seemed to shift and sway as if they had a life of their own. I stood at the edge, flashlight in hand, while my friends stayed safely behind, their faces a mix of amusement and thinly veiled worry. "Are you sure about this?" someone called out. I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. What's the worst that could happen? The first few steps felt easy enough. The flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the fog dense rows of corn. But the deeper I went, the more oppressive it became. The air felt heavier, thick with the scent of earth, and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. The stalks whispered as I brushed past them, a sound too soft and too deliberate to be wind. Paused, shining the light around me. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. About 20 feet in, I stumbled across something strange, a patch of corn that had been flattened, the stalks twisted and broken. The earth was damp, and when I crouched down to inspect it, I saw a thick, dark sap oozing from the stalks. My stomach churned. A sudden rustling behind me made me whirl around, the flashlight beam shaking. "Hello," I called, my voice smaller than I intended. No answer. Just more whispers, louder now, coming from every direction. That's when I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt, half human, half something else. The edges were jagged, the toes elongated like claws. They led deeper into the field, disappearing into the shadows. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Pride, curiosity, or sheer stupidity pushed me forward. The whispers grew louder. I swore they were saying my name. The flashlight flickered, its once reliable beam sputtering against the encroaching darkness. I smacked it against my palm, but it was no use. The batteries were dying, leaving me bathed in the dim glow of a pale moon. The whispers that had been faint before grew louder, sharper, like a chorus of voices just out of sync, layering over one another in a way that made my skin crawl. Then I saw a shadow shifting at the edge of my vision, too fast and too large to be anything normal. My breath caught as I turned, the flashlight shaking in my trembling hand. The beam landed on empty rows of corn, the stalks swaying gently as if something had just passed through. I told myself it was just the wind, even as the air around me was unnaturally still. Snap. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the sharp, wet crack of something breaking, like bones splintering under pressure. My heart raced as my eyes darted around, searching for the source. Then I saw them, two unblinking eyes glowing faintly in the dark, set far apart and far too high above the ground to belong to any animal I'd ever known. They didn't blink, waver, just stared directly at me. The shape beneath those eyes began to emerge as my vision adjusted to the dark. Limbs, if you could call them that, protruded at awkward angles, bending and snapping like branches, caught in a storm. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of sinew and corn stalks, the latter twisting and growing out of its flesh as though it were part of the field itself. The whispers crescendoed, almost like laughter, as the thing took a single step forward. My legs refused to move, frozen in terror as the silhouette loomed closer. I didn't want to see it fully, yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The rows of corn seemed endless as I sprinted blindly, the stalks slapping against my arms and face. My flashlight was useless now, sputtering weakly before going dark entirely. I tossed it aside, focusing instead on the faint sliver of moonlight that barely penetrated the dense canopy of corn. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed. They grew louder, more distinct, until I could hear them clearly. Your name. Your name. I stopped for a moment, my chest heaving, my ears straining to confirm what I thought I'd heard. It wasn't just a trick of the wind. The voices were calling my name. My full name, spoken in tones that were both familiar and alien. As I tried to catch my breath, the ground beneath me shifted, softening unnaturally. The rows of corn began to close in, the stalks leaning toward each other like a living wall. Every path I tried to take was blocked, the labyrinth tightening around me with every step. It was as if the field itself were alive, conspiring to keep me trapped within its borders. I stumbled and fell, landing hard in a patch of rotting corn. The stench was overwhelming, a sickly sweet aroma of decay that turned my stomach. As I pushed myself up, my hands brushed against something hard beneath the soil. Bones, long, jagged, and brittle, lay scattered beneath the decayed stalks. Some looked human. I screamed, scrambling to my feet just as the whispers turned to an ear-splitting cacophony. The field seemed to pulse with life, the stalks swaying violently as if in celebration. And in the distance, those unblinking eyes reappeared, closer now, and impossible to escape. The creature emerged fully now, its grotesque form illuminated by the faint moonlight. Its limbs snapped and reformed with every step, twisting in ways that defied logic. Its eyes, glowing and unblinking, bore into me as if they could see my very soul. It didn't lunge at me, it didn't need to. Instead, it moved with an unnerving deliberation, circling me as though savoring the moment. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from deep within the creature. You don't belong here, it hissed, though its mouth didn't move. The words were inside my head, spoken in a voice that was both my own and someone else's. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a broken stalk of corn, and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The creature paused, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. It seemed almost amused. Then it lunged not at me, but past me, forcing me to stumble back into the rotting corn. My foot caught on something, and I fell again, the stalk slipping from my grasp. The creature towered over me now, its limbs writhing as it whispered something I couldn't understand. Images flooded my mind, memories I hadn't thought of in years, moments of guilt and fear that I had buried deep. It was inside my head, sifting through my worst fears like pages in a book. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature. It struck one of its limbs, causing it to recoil with a shriek that rattled my bones. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted, not caring which direction I ran as long as it was away. The cornfield fought back. The stalks reached out like fingers, scratching and clawing at my arms and legs. Roots seemed to rise from the ground, tripping me at every step. But somehow I found a narrow path that seemed to lead toward the edge of the field. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. "Stay," they demanded. "Stay with us." I pushed forward, the creature's guttural cries echoing behind me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop until I burst into an open clearing. The cool night air hit me like a slap, and I collapsed to my knees, sobbing. When I finally made it back to my friends, they stared at me as though I were a ghost. My clothes were torn, my arms and legs covered in scratches. In my hand, I clutched a broken stalk of corn, as though it were a lifeline. "You've been gone for 2 days," one of them said, their voice trembling. "That's impossible," I argued. "I was only in there for a few hours." They exchanged uneasy glances before the sheriff arrived. He didn't ask questions, he just told. "Meadow, leave," his tone grave. "Never speak of this again," he warned, his eyes flicking toward the cornfield. "And don't come back." That night, I dreamed of unblinking eyes. And when I woke up, a single stalk of corn was growing in my backyard, swaying gently in the windless air. The days that followed my escape, or what I thought was an escape, blurred together like a fever dream. Sleep came in fits and starts, and when it did, the nightmares took over. The creature's glowing, unblinking eyes were always there, watching from the darkness, growing closer with each dream. But waking up wasn't much better. The whispers didn't stop. Faint, barely audible, but there. Always there. I told myself it was just trauma, my mind playing tricks after what I'd been through. That's what the rational part of me wanted to believe. But deep down, I knew better. The cornfield wasn't finished with me. Kiowan. It started subtly. At first, I noticed the faint scent of earth and decay in my house, like the smell of the rotting corn patch I'd stumbled into. Then came the scratching sounds in the walls at night, soft at first, but growing louder. My friends stopped answering my calls after the second day. Even the sheriff, who'd seemed so grave and protective, wouldn't meet my eyes when I ran into him at the gas station. It was as if I carried something with me, something they could sense, but wouldn't acknowledge. But the real horror began 3 days later. I stepped out onto my back porch that morning, bleary-eyed and clutching a mug of coffee, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. The moment I opened the door, I froze. A single stalk of corn was growing in the center of my backyard. It shouldn't have been possible. I lived in a townhome surrounded by asphalt and chain link fences, miles from the nearest farmland. Yet there it stood, tall and green, swaying gently in a breeze that didn't exist. I approached it slowly, my coffee forgotten, my breath hitching with every step. The closer I got, the more I felt it, a presence radiating from the stalk, as if it were alive, watching. At its base, the soil was black and wet, oozing that same dark sap I'd seen in the field. And then I saw them. 2 tiny, glowing eyes nestled within the shadow of the leaves, unblinking and impossibly still. They weren't human, but they weren't entirely alien either. They looked familiar, like a distorted reflection of my own. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know who I was pleading with. The stalk? The creature? Myself? The whispers began again, soft and insidious, seeping into my ears like smoke. "You brought it with you," they hissed. "It will never let you go." I stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven patio stones and falling hard onto my back. When I looked up, the stalk was taller. Or maybe it wasn't. It was hard to tell, but it felt taller. Looming over me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the yard. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. But locks wouldn't stop it. I knew that now. That night, I sat in the dark, clutching a knife I'd taken from the kitchen. My lights flickered, the air grew heavy, and the whispers were everywhere. "Come back to us," they urged. "It's time to feed." The scratching in the walls grew louder, more insistent, until it wasn't scratching anymore. It was pounding. Something wanted in. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, the cornstalk was gone, but the shadow it left behind on the lawn remained, a dark, uneven patch of earth shaped like an eye. I don't know how long I have. Maybe the cornfield will come for me tonight. Maybe it'll wait until I've let my guard down. But if you're reading this, take my advice: don't go into the cornfield. Don't listen to the whispers. And if you see a stalk of corn growing where it doesn't belong, run. But know this running may not save you. That night, I locked every door, bolted every window, and drew the curtains tight. It felt ridiculous. How could locks and fabric stop whatever had followed me? But I needed to believe. I could do something to keep it out. The whispers, though faint, never stopped. They wove through the silence like threads, pulling tighter and tighter until I thought I'd scream. Then came the pounding. It started as a single, distant thud, like someone dropping a heavy box on the floor above me. But I lived alone, and my house didn't have a second floor. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the walls. My grip on the knife in my hand tightened as I turned toward the source of the noise, my breath shallow and ragged. Thud. 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 The pounding wasn't just loud, it was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. It moved closer, not through the halls, but within the walls themselves, as if something massive was crawling inside. The structure of my home. I backed away, the knife trembling in my hand, and stared at the plaster as it bulged outward, straining as though it could no longer contain whatever was inside. "Let me out," the whispers said, layered in 1,000 voices, some unfamiliar, some disturbingly recognizable, friends, family, even my own. I stumbled backward into the living room, the pounding now relentless. The walls groaned under. The pressure, cracks spiderwebbing along their surface. One crack split open, and from the dark gap seeped thick, black sap, the same substance I'd seen in the cornfield. Its smell hit me. First sweet, cloying, and wrong, like rotting fruit mixed with metal. I gagged, stumbling further. Back. That's when I heard it. The scraping of something sharp, something clawed, dragging across the floor behind me. My entire body froze as cold air brushed the back of my neck. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't need to. The whispers confirmed what I already knew. "You were never meant to leave," they hissed, their words wrapping around me like chains. "You belong to the field now." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned. The creature stood in the center of my living room, illuminated only by the flickering light of a single failing lamp. Its eyes, those horrible, unblinking eyes, glowed faintly, fixed directly on me. The rest of its body was a nightmare-given form, an ever-shifting mass of limbs, broken and reforming, its movements jerky and unnatural. Corn stalks twisted through its flesh, their leaves rustling softly as though stirred by an invisible wind. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. The floor beneath my feet began to change, the smooth hardwood warping and buckling as corn sprouted from its surface. The walls peeled away, revealing rows upon rows of stalks, stretching endlessly into a darkness that swallowed everything. My home was gone. The field had claimed me. No, I whispered, backing away. But there was nowhere to go. The creature tilted its head, its limbs cracking like dead wood as it mimicked my movements. You ran, it said, though its mouth never moved. The voice was inside my head again, an amalgamation of all the whispers that had haunted me. But you can't run from us. You can't run from what you are. What am I stammered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer, but it didn't need to. As I stared into those unblinking eyes, memories flooded. Back snippets of dreams I'd dismissed, moments I'd forgotten, or perhaps suppressed. The field wasn't just a place. It was alive, a consciousness older than time, and somehow I was part of it. Feed us, the voices demanded, a chorus that rose to a deafening crescendo. Feed us, or we will feed on you. I screamed, lunging at the creature with the knife, but the blade shattered against its bark-like skin. It didn't flinch, didn't react, only stared as the cornfield swallowed me whole. I woke to silence. The whispers were gone, the creature nowhere in sight. I was lying in my backyard, dirt and black sap clinging to my skin. My house stood behind me, intact, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The corn stalk was still there, tall and healthy, its leaves glistening with dew. And at its base, something new had sprouted, rows of smaller stalks, their tips capped with tiny, glowing eyes. I stumbled backward, but the earth beneath me shifted, softening unnaturally. When I looked down, I saw more stalks beginning to push through the soil, each one bending toward me as if reaching out. Feed us, the voices whispered again, faint but undeniable. I fled into the house, slamming the door behind me. My reflection in the window stopped me. Cold. My eyes, they didn't look right. They were too bright, too wide. They didn't blink. The whispers returned, louder now, wrapping around me like a shroud. You can't escape. You are ours. I haven't left the house since. Every day the corn spreads further. I see it in the cracks of the sidewalk, the edges of the windows, even growing through the tiles of my bathroom floor. The whispers are constant now, no longer confined to the night. I know it's only a matter of time before the field takes me completely. But worse than that is the fear that it won't stop with me. If you're reading this, consider this your warning. The cornfield doesn't just stay in the fields. It grows, spreads, consumes. And it's always looking for more. Are you sure you're safe? Are you sure there's nothing growing where it shouldn't be? Look around. Listen closely. Do you hear it? The rustling? The whispers? If you dare, share the story. But remember, every retelling feeds it. Every word brings it closer. And now that you've read it, the field knows your name.